We've all seen it. Whether on the page or on the screen, it's one of the most iconic moments in modern mythology. The ground shakes, the sky turns a fiery red, and the great dark tower of Barad-dûr, the fortress of the enemy, topped with its searching, lidless eye, collapses into a storm of dust and ruin. It's the ultimate victory shot, the crescendo of a symphony of hope and despair. The armies of the West, outnumbered and on the brink of annihilation before the Black Gate, look up and see the symbol of their oppression vanish. The eagles cry, the clouds break, and a new age begins. It's the end. Good has triumphed. Evil has been vanquished. And we, the audience, can finally breathe a collective sigh of relief. But here's the thing that nobody ever really talks about. We see the effects of Sauron's defeat. We see his fortress crumble, his armies scatter, his dark clouds dissipate. But the tower, the armies, the darkness, those were just the instruments. They were the shadow cast by the real entity. The true event, the moment of absolute definitive defeat, didn't happen to a building. It happened inside a mind, a consciousness of immense age, power, and intellect. And while everyone watched the tower fall, nobody ever stopped to ask the far more terrifying question: what did Sauron feel the second it happened? Tolkien, in his quiet, deliberate way, gives us clues. They are scattered across his letters, buried in appendices, and woven into the very fabric of the narrative. When you piece them together, the picture that emerges is of something far more intimate and devastating than a military loss. It's a story of metaphysical annihilation, of a being watching his own soul be unmade in real time. What we're about to uncover changes the nature of that final victory. It reframes the fall of the Dark Lord not just as a triumph, but as a tragedy of cosmic proportions, a cautionary tale about what happens when you pour all of yourself into a single, terrible idea. Have you ever worked on something for years, a project that consumed your every waking thought and poured your heart and soul into it, only to watch a computer crash, delete it all in an instant? You know that hollow, sickening feeling in the pit of your stomach? Now, imagine that project wasn't just something you made. Imagine it was you. Imagine a core part of your very consciousness, your spirit, was saved on that corrupted hard drive. That is where we are going. Beyond the rubble and the cheering armies, we are going to try to stand at the psychic epicenter of a dying god's mind and witness the cost of absolute ambition. To understand what Sauron lost, we first have to establish what, precisely, he was. The common understanding is straightforward enough. Sauron is the Dark Lord, the second in a line of cosmic evil that began with his master, Morgoth. He is a deceiver, a master of fire and shadow who wants to dominate all the free peoples of Middle-earth. To do this, he forged in secret a master ring, the One Ring, to control the rings of power given to elves, dwarves, and men. His power is tied to it, his armies are commanded by it, his will is projected through it. As long as the ring exists, he can never be truly defeated. If it is destroyed, he will fall. This is the baseline, the plot mechanics we all know. But that phrase, his power is tied to it, is doing an enormous amount of work, and we tend to gloss over its terrifyingly literal meaning. It's not just a magical key fob that gives him access to his evil network. It's not just a focus for his power, like a wizard's staff. Tolkien is incredibly specific about the transaction that took place in the fires of Mount Doom in the Second Age. Sauron, who was originally a Maia, an angelic spirit, a being of immense native power who helped to build the very world, made a choice. He poured a substantial portion of his own Feia, his spirit, his very essence and being, into the forging of that small golden object. This is the complication that changes everything. In his letters, Tolkien explains it plainly with the clarity of a physicist describing a law of nature. He wrote that in order to make the ring the ruling ring, Sauron had been obliged to let a great part of his own former power pass into it, and elsewhere that the ring contained the prime of his power. Think about what that means. This wasn't a strategic gamble. It was an act of profound and irreversible metaphysical commitment. In order to gain greater control over the physical world, over the flesh and stone and wills of others, he had to diminish his own spiritual self. He traded a portion of his immortal, inviolable being for a portion of his will made manifest and durable in the world of matter. The ring wasn't just a tool of his power, it was a vessel for his power. It was a physical extension of his soul. He didn't just make the ring. In a very real sense, he became the ring. This raises the stakes of its destruction from a simple strategic loss to something far more profound. Destroying the ring isn't just disarming Sauron, it is, in the most literal sense possible, destroying a piece of him. It's an act of spiritual amputation performed at the source. The story of the ring is not just the story of a weapon, it is the story of Sauron's fragmented, externalized, and ultimately vulnerable soul. Let's try to truly unpack this idea of pouring your being into an object. For us, as mortals, it's a beautiful metaphor. A painter pours himself into his masterpiece. A composer pours her soul into a symphony. We invest our time, our emotion, our focus, and a piece of our creative spirit resides in the work. But for an Ainur, a primordial spirit who existed before the physical world was even sung into being, it's not a metaphor at all. It is a literal transference of essence. Imagine your consciousness is a flame. You can use that flame to light 1,000 candles, to spread warmth and illumination, but the core flame remains within you. Sauron's act was different. He took a massive part of that core flame itself, the hottest, brightest part, and placed it inside a lantern of gold, which he then sent out into the world. He was now weaker in himself, but his influence, projected through that lantern, was magnified 1,000-fold. The lantern could go places he could not, influence people he could not reach, and, most importantly, it would endure even if his physical form was destroyed, as it later was in the fall of Numenor. It was his anchor in the world of matter. So why would he do this? Why would a being of such immense power take such an astonishing risk? Because this decision reveals Sauron's core philosophy and his fundamental tragic flaw. He was a Maia of Aule the smith, a master of craft and substance. He came to believe that the spirit was only valuable insofar as it could impose its will upon matter. To him, an unexpressed will, a spirit that did not dominate, order, and control the physical world, was a useless one. It was just potential, wasting away in the abstract. The ring was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was the perfect fusion of spirit and matter, will made tangible, an idea forged into an eternal, physical law. He didn't see it as diminishing himself. He saw it as perfecting himself by making his power permanent and independent of his own fragile form. But in doing so, he chained his immortal destiny to a tiny, physical object. He gave his enemies a target. For thousands of years, Sauron then existed in this state of profound division. A part of him, the commanding will, the great eye, resided in his fortress of Barad-dûr. But the other part, the best and strongest part, the prime of his power and being, was lost to him, wandering the world on the finger of an elven king, then a river creature, then a hobbit. Can you imagine the constant aching vulnerability of that existence? Knowing the most vital piece of your soul is out there, somewhere, beyond your control? It's no wonder his entire focus became the search. He wasn't just looking for a weapon. He was looking for himself. Imagine the psychology of that long, dark wait. After his defeat by the last alliance of elves and men, Sauron is vanquished. Isildur cuts the ring from his hand, and his physical form dissolves. But he is not destroyed, precisely because of the ring. His spirit endures, a shadow of malice, because the core of his power is safe, held in the golden circlet. For 1,000 years he hides, a formless fear in the dark places of the world. He slowly, painstakingly, begins to pull himself back together. He becomes the necromancer of Dol Guldur. Eventually, he returns to Mordor and begins to rebuild his strength. But throughout this entire millennium, there is a hollowness at his core. He is a king in exile from his own soul. He can build his fortress, gather his armies of orcs, and bend the wills of men to his service. But he is operating at a fraction of his true capacity. He is a shadow of his former self, because the very substance of that self is missing. The entire narrative of The Lord of the Rings, from a certain point of view, is driven by this desperate existential search. It's not just a geopolitical quest for a superweapon. It is the story of a being trying frantically to reclaim his own spirit before his enemies can find it and destroy it. The 9 Nazgul, his most terrifying servants, are not just lieutenants. They are extensions of his will, psychic bloodhounds dispatched to sniff out the scent of his own missing essence. Their shrieks are not just cries of terror. They are echoes of their master's own desperate longing and rage. Let's try, for a moment, to imagine Sauron's consciousness during this time. Not the towering figure in black armor from the movies, but what he truly was in the Third Age. A vast, silent, burning will, enthroned in the darkness of Barad-dûr. A mind that stretched across the poisoned plains of Mordor, a singular focus of malice and command. And right in the center of that immense consciousness, a void, a ring-shaped hole, a constant low-grade psychic pain that would sometimes flare into unimaginable agony. He feels it when the ring is used. When Frodo puts it on at Weathertop to escape the Nazgul, a shockwave must have shot through Sauron's being, a phantom limb sensation from a part of himself he could not see or control. He feels him again, more powerfully, at Amon Hen, when Frodo sits on the seat of seeing. For a terrifying moment, their minds almost touch, two parts of the same original being separated by 1,000 leagues and 3,000 years. These aren't just intelligence reports reaching the Dark Lord. They are direct, painful, sensory inputs from his own lost soul. In this light, the great eye of Sauron, the symbol that dominates the story, becomes something more than a metaphor for his watchfulness. It is the perfect representation of his diminished state, a disembodied, focused will, stripped of all else, existing only to see, to search, to find, and to reclaim what was taken. He has become his own search party. His entire being has been reduced to a single burning imperative: find my precious. Now let's fast forward to the climax of the War of the Ring. From Sauron's perspective, his plan is on the verge of absolute success. His victory is a mathematical certainty. His overwhelming armies have crushed the defenses of Osgiliath and are now smashing themselves against the walls of Minas Tirith. He knows the city will fall, and even if it doesn't, he has a far greater trap laid. The new so-called king, this heir of Isildur, has foolishly marched a tiny, pathetic army to the Black Gate of Mordor itself. It's a gesture of such insane, suicidal pride that Sauron can only interpret it one way. The fool must have the ring. He must have claimed it for his own, and now, in his arrogance, believes he can challenge the master. This is Sauron's ultimate miscalculation, and it is born directly from his core philosophy. He is fundamentally incapable of comprehending that anyone, presented with the ultimate instrument of power, would choose to destroy it. The very thought is alien to his nature, a logical impossibility. He can understand wanting to use it, to seize it, to hide it away out of fear. But to voluntarily unmake absolute power? It's like a financier trying to comprehend the desire to burn $1 billion. It simply does not compute in his operating system. His entire worldview is built on the premise that the will to dominate is the prime motive of all intelligent life. And so he empties Mordor of its armies, sending them to the Black Gate to crush this pathetic rebellion and reclaim his property, his very self, from the hand of this new king. He leaves his own lands, the plains of Gorgoroth and the path to Mount Doom itself, almost entirely unguarded. It's a detail we often overlook. Why was it so easy for Frodo and Sam to walk across that final stretch? Because Sauron's attention, his entire immense consciousness, was focused completely on the battle at the Morannon. He was like a chess grandmaster, laser-focused on what he believed was the checkmate, entirely oblivious to a pawn sneaking across the other side of the board. Then the unthinkable happens. In the heart of his domain, in the Samath Naur, the chambers of fire where the ring was forged, Frodo puts it on. He claims it for his own. And in that one, final, terrible instant, Sauron sees him. The full, blinding, catastrophic truth crashes down upon his mind. Tolkien's description is chilling. And far away, as Frodo put on the ring and claimed it for his own, even in Samath Naur, the very heart of his realm, the power in Barad-dûr was shaken, and the tower trembled from its foundations to its proud and bitter crown. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, and the magnitude of his own folly was revealed to him in a blinding flash. In that flash he saw it all: the hobbits, the Council of Elrond, the whole desperate, insane, impossible plan of his enemies. The veil was torn from his eye. The foundation of his entire strategy, his entire being, was revealed as a house of cards built on a single flawed assumption. The panic must have been absolute, a cold dread colder than the void between stars. The reaction is instantaneous and convulsive. His mind, for centuries focused outward on the geopolitics of Middle-earth, on Gondor, on Rohan, on Aragorn, suddenly snaps inward with the force of a collapsing star. It is a desperate last-second lunge towards that one single point of failure. The command goes out, a thought of pure, screaming terror that blasts through the minds of his servants. The Nazgul. He sends his swiftest and most terrible slaves, the Ringwraiths, hurtling towards Mount Doom. It is the reflexive action of a body flinging its arms up to protect its head from a fatal blow. But it is far, far too late. We all know what happens next: the struggle, the bite, the gleeful dance of Gollum at the edge of the precipice. And then he falls. The ring, holding the prime of Sauron's power, his will, his malice, and a vast portion of his immortal spirit, plunges into the fiery chasm from which it was born. And then? What? This is the core of our exploration. What does it actually feel like? It is not an explosion. It is an implosion, a spiritual black hole opening in the center of his being. That vast portion of his Fia that he had poured into the ring, that he had externalized and anchored in gold, is now held in a physical matrix that is being unmade by the primordial fires of the earth. This is the ultimate price of his ambition. This is the bill for his Faustian bargain coming due. He sought to bind the world to his will by binding his will to the world through a physical object. In doing so, he made a part of his eternal spirit subject to the laws of physics. He gave it a vulnerability that no Ainur should ever have. His enemies, unable to defeat his spirit directly, found a loophole. They found a way to attack his soul by attacking a piece of metal. They found a back door into the very source code of his being. Let's try to imagine that moment from his perspective. For the vast, disembodied consciousness in Barad-dûr, it must have been a soundless scream that ripped through the foundations of his existence. The ring-shaped hole that had been a dull ache in his soul for 3 millennia doesn't just stay a hole, it becomes a vortex. The spiritual energy, the will, the very substance of his being that he had invested isn't simply returned to him, diminished. It isn't just lost, it is utterly cancelled, annihilated, unwritten from the great song of creation. It is the feeling of a part of your own mind, your own memory, your own identity, ceasing to exist, not just for you, but for the universe itself. The connection is severed, and the backlash is catastrophic. Think of a power grid for a massive city. Now imagine the primary generator doesn't just switch off, it vaporizes. The power that sustained Barad-dûr, the will that drove the legions of orcs, the palpable aura of fear that held his entire empire together, it was all running on that spiritual generator that just went offline. Instantly, the system collapses. The foundations of the Dark Tower, which Tolkien implies were held together not just by stone and mortar, but by the force of Sauron's will, lose their architect. They crack. The tower, which was as much a projection of his mind as a physical structure, disintegrates. It doesn't just fall, it unmakes itself. Across the plains at the Black Gate, the same psychic shockwave hits his armies. The orcs, goblins, and trolls, who were driven forward by a single commanding mind, are suddenly rudderless. The puppet master's strings have been cut. They are filled with a terror that isn't entirely their own, but is an echo of their master's final, agonizing moment. They scatter, they turn on each other, they throw themselves into pits. They are utterly lost, a body spasming after the brain has died. And the eye, that symbol of his focused, searching will which had been fixed in horror on Mount Doom. Tolkien writes that it wavered, grew pale, and passed away. For one final, uncomprehending moment of agony, it widened, and then it was extinguished. The light went out, but the consciousness behind it was still there, for a few final, terrible seconds of awareness. In that moment, the ultimate irony of his entire existence must have been laid bare. The risk he took in the Second Age, the act of hubris in forging the ring to ensure his dominion forever, had finally, after thousands of years, come due. The power he had externalized to control the world had become the very weapon that unmade him. The chain he had forged to bind others had, in the end, only bound him to a mortal fate. His greatest strength had become his only weakness. It is a perfect, terrible, and exquisitely just conclusion. The master of control had lost control of the one thing that truly mattered, himself. But Tolkien, in his genius, doesn't leave us entirely in the dark about Sauron's final moments of consciousness. He gives us one last haunting image. After the tower falls and the ground ceases to shake, the armies of the West see a new shadow rising from the ruins of Mordor. A great cloud, black and vast, forms itself into a towering shape, a final image of Sauron as he once was. Huge and terrible, and its vast arms were stretched out towards the west in a vast gesture of menace and of prayer. He reaches out a grasping but utterly impotent hand. It is a final, desperate gesture of malice, a last spasm of a will that has dominated an age. He is trying to hold on, to maintain his grip on the world, but there is nothing there. It is, Tolkien writes, a phantom of malice only. And then a great wind comes up from the west, and it catches this towering shadow. and it simply blows it away, and it is gone, and silence falls. This is the core insight. This is the moment we miss when we only focus on the falling masonry. He is not killed, not in the way a mortal man is killed. Sauron is diminished to a point of absolute and final impotence. Tolkien's final verdict is chilling in its quiet finality. He becomes a spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows but cannot again grow or take shape. He is reduced. He still exists, somewhere, as a disembodied, powerless point of hatred in the void. But he can never again interact with the world. He can never again build, or command, or even influence. He is reduced to nothing more than a bitter memory of his own malice. And this is the quiet tragedy we so often miss. It is not just a villain getting his comeuppance. It is the story of a being of almost limitless potential, one of the Maia, who sang the world into existence, a spirit of incredible creative power, who spent millennia investing all of that energy, all of his craft, all of his spirit, into a single, corrupting project of total control. And in the single second that it failed, all of that investment, all of that work, all of that self, was not just lost. It was erased from existence. It is the ultimate story of a wasted life, on a scale that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. Think of any person in our own world who sacrifices their humanity, their relationships, their empathy, their soul, for a single, all-consuming goal, be it power, wealth, or fame. They pour all of themselves into that external validation. What is left of them when that goal is suddenly taken away? What remains when the project fails? The answer, for Sauron, was nothing. A gnawing echo in an empty room. He sought to become everything, and in doing so, engineered his own reduction to absolute zero. There is a profound and terrible melancholy in this. We don't feel pity for Sauron, the architect of unspeakable suffering and death. We cannot mourn the passing of such evil. But we can, and perhaps we should, feel a sense of cosmic awe at the scale of his fall. The sheer, terrifying emptiness of his end is a thing of philosophical weight. He wanted to be the absolute master of Middle-earth, to have every will and every stone bend to his design. In the end, he became less than the meanest orc he had commanded. He became nothing. A whisper of forgotten hate blown away on the wind. And who accomplished this monumental act of unmaking? Not a great warrior with a shining sword, not a wise wizard with ancient spells. It was accomplished by the one type of creature in all of Middle-earth that Sauron could never understand. A hobbit. Small, unassuming, valuing a good meal and a comfortable chair over power and dominion. The victory of Frodo and Sam is not just a military one. It is a profound philosophical one. It is the victory of the small, the humble, and the deeply mortal over the vast, the proud, and the supposedly eternal. Sauron's entire world-view, his belief in the supremacy of the will to power, was not just defeated on the battlefield. It was fundamentally proven wrong by the actions of two small people who just wanted to go home. This is the pivot where the story of a Dark Lord becomes a story about all of us. Sauron's fall is a grand mythological warning against the seductive belief that our worth is measured by our control over the external world. It's a story about the profound danger of pouring so much of ourselves into one single external thing, a career, a status, an ideology, even a relationship, that we forget how to exist without it. We externalize our sense of self, making it contingent on something fragile and outside of our true being. Sauron's tragedy was that he made himself completely identical with his project of domination. He and the ring were, in the end, the same entity. When the project failed, he failed with it, completely, irrevocably, and absolutely. He had no other aspect of himself to fall back on. He had traded his soul for the world, and when his claim on the world was denied, he found he had nothing left. His balance sheet had one single massive asset, and when it was wiped out, he was left with a spiritual debt he could never repay. He was utterly bankrupt. So the next time you see that tower fall, in Peter Jackson's epic film or in the theater of your own mind, try to see what's happening behind the spectacle. Don't just see the crumbling stone and the cheering soldiers. See the crumbling of a consciousness. Try to hear the silent psychic scream of a being watching 30,000 years of relentless work and a vast portion of his own soul being vaporized in a single, fiery instant. See that final, impotent gesture of a hand made of shadow and malice, reaching for a world it can no longer touch, a world it can no longer command. We began this journey by asking a simple question. What did Sauron feel? The answer, in the end, is a feeling that likely lies beyond our mortal comprehension, but we can glimpse its terrible edges. It is the feeling of absolute unmaking, the feeling of ceasing to be. It is the spiritual equivalent of a star that, after burning for eons, finally exhausts its fuel and collapses under its own immense weight into a black hole of infinite density and zero light. The true strength of the free peoples of Middle-earth was that their identities were not monolithic. They were woven from countless threads, from friendships, from their love for their homes, from hope and memory and song. They had things to fall back upon beyond the singular goal of victory. Aragorn was a healer and a lover, as well as a king. Samwise was a gardener. Their selves were rich and complex. When Sauron fell, he had nothing. His entire being was leveraged against a single golden asset that had just gone into catastrophic default. The story of Middle-earth, then, is not just about the triumph of good over evil. It's also a quiet, terrifying meditation on what it means to lose yourself completely in the pursuit of a singular ambition. It reminds us that the greatest fortresses are not made of stone and will and fear. They are made of the connections we forge with others and the things we love, not for the power they give us, but for their own sake. And in that final, profound moment, as the wind from the west blows the last shadow of malice away, and a deep silence falls over the poisoned land of Mordor, we are left with the quiet, humbling truth. The most terrible fate isn't to be defeated in battle. It's to have invested your entire being into a single thing, and to watch that thing be taken from you, leaving you so utterly irrelevant that the world simply and quietly moves on without you.